Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. And we have a familiar face with us here, Newt Gingrich. We're going to do this show a little differently, and one guest, focus on the guest and the issues that we want to discuss. When I began this program several years ago, that's what we did. And so I want to mix it up a little bit in the future. One guest, a guest who I think has a lot to offer, who probably doesn't have enough time on most shows to express his or her views. I call these long-form discussions, and I think they're very, very helpful. They're different, and I know many of you like this. And so, Newt Gingrich, I want to welcome you, my friend. First of all, Newt was elected to the House of Representatives in 1978, the first Republican elected from that district ever. He started the Conservative Opportunity Society when he was in the House of Representatives in 1983. Because he didn't like what was taking place with the establishment and so forth in the House of Representatives. In 1989, he's elected minority whip. People were shocked by that, but here you had an outsider, a rebel who was elected the minority whip. And then we had the contract with America, which changed everything. 1994, the Republican candidates ran on an agenda. It was a very, very popular agenda that Newt put together with others. And for the first time in decades, the first time, I think since 1954, in 1994, the Republicans took the House of Representatives with 54 seats and shocked everybody except Newt Gingrich, who would soon become Speaker of the House. Newt Gingrich, with that background, contract with America, you were an outsider fighting the insiders and so forth and so on. Do you see a similarity or a parallel with you and the way you approached politics and government and Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think, Mark, that there's a parallel between Reagan, what we did with the contract, and then what Trump is doing. Reagan's sort of the first real breakout from accepting the principles of the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He doesn't totally break through. He defeats the Soviet Empire, and he relaunches the American economy, and he renews a belief in American civic culture. But in the end, he doesn't decisively change it. And frankly, George H.W. Bush didn't have a clue what Reagan stood for, and there was a lot of backsliding after Reagan left. We came in, and it's fair to say that the contract with America was essentially Ronald Reagan. We took ideas. Welfare reform, for example, starts with Reagan in 1965, running for governor. We passed it in 1996. So there's parallel. I was a rebel. I once said I'm a genuine revolutionary because I am. I think that the Rooseveltian establishment, which has been in power since 1933, has decayed, is corrupt, has gone far to the left in radical values, and is incapable of solving the country's problems. So I was very much in favor of Trump because I think that President Trump represented sort of the third stage in this effort, and he grew out of the Tea Party movement, which when they backslid after they backslid after Reagan left, they backslid after I left, and Republicans find it very hard to understand these core principles. Well, that led to the rebellion of the Tea Party movement, and the Tea Party movement, I think, leads directly to Donald Trump, and Trump is the first one who is articulate enough, tough enough, persistent enough, has enough guts to really profoundly change things, and he is the biggest change agent, I think, that Republicans have had probably since Abraham Lincoln.
And you saw something in him early on. You backed him early in 2016. That's why I'm wondering. You backed him early in 2016. Rush Limbaugh saw early on that he was different, that he that regardless of what people were saying about him and so forth, Rush was a rebel. You were a rebel. What did you see in Donald Trump in 2016? Because it was early on. You know, he hadn't run any government or anything of the sort. I feel like in his second term, he's actually become more conservative and more desirous of pushing back big government and getting liberty back to the individual and power back to the states. What did you see in 2016?
He really had a profound sense of how big the change had to be. And nobody else running did. In fact, I had one conversation with one of the front runners trying to explain why following the establishment wouldn't work, and it was just a dead end. I mean, they couldn't imagine the level of change that we needed. Trump could, partly because he wasn't an insider. He didn't know what the rules were. He couldn't think outside the box because he didn't think there was a box. And as a result, he was much more dramatically willing to say things and do things than any of his competitors. The other part of that, I think, that really attracted me, Trump's not a conservative. Trump is the most effective anti-liberal in modern history. But it's based on what he sees as common sense, not Bill Buckley or any other kind of theoretical conservatism. And I just thought the sheer courage, as a historian, I've always believed that really big change requires a level of toughness and a level of courage that is very abnormal. Happens very seldom. We study those kind of people, for centuries. Robert the Bruce in Scotland, for example, or Charles de Gaulle rebuilding France after World War II. These are giants. And I could sense that Trump had the potential to just have the sheer guts to do what would work. And frankly, I thought the other candidates were all just normal politicians. And I thought, normal politicians were not going to solve anything because they couldn't break out of the rules of the old order.
And in its first 7-8 months, you've seen what Donald Trump has done. Has he exceeded even your high expectations of it?
Yeah, I would say he is 30 to 40% more creatively aggressive than I would have expected. I expected a lot. And I'd worked with the America First Policy Institute, and I knew that they had tons of executive orders, and I knew the people around him pretty well. But I have to say that he has somehow captured the moment, and that he gets up every day and in about 16 to 20 hours gets an amazing amount done, and then gets 4 hours of sleep and gets up the next day and spends 16 to 20 hours getting a heck of a lot of stuff. And it's very wide-ranging. That's why I said you have to understand that he never thinks outside the box because he doesn't think there is a box. So 1 minute he's engaged in dealing with the left-wing goofiness of something like Cracker Barrel or Bud Light. The next minute he's dealing with Ukraine. Then he comes back and he's dealing with crime in New York City or crime in Washington, D.C. If you watch the speed with which he goes from topic to topic, it's pretty extraordinary.
Do you think a lot of elected Republicans, official Republicans, quote unquote, are still having difficulty coming to terms with this?
Oh, yeah, look, I think there are times I have trouble coming to terms with it. Look, this is a phenomenon. He doesn't resemble anything that you study in political science. He's much more somebody you'd study in history. He's an entrepreneur. He's not a corporate leader. He doesn't sit around with a group of staff telling him what his choices are. He picks a choice and then tells his staff to implement it. He's a very driven, direct person. And then, frankly, he has about 10% of his personality that is self-destructive and does things that don't help him. And that I think approval for his policies is 10 or 15 points higher than approval of him. And that's because of this need he has to go out to the edge and then jump over a little bit and then dance back. But in the process, he unnerves people. And I think if you're a normal politician, normal elected Republican, one of the things you want is a sense of calm and certainty, because politics is scary enough anyway. Remember, anybody who's in the House is at the risk of losing their job every 2 years. Anybody who's in the Senate is at risk of losing their job every 6 years. So there's a certain level of insecurity in the whole process of being an elected official. And Trump is not a stabilizing personality. He is a change-oriented, dynamic, charismatic leader who leaves behind him a wake of extraordinary things. And I think clearly he's on the way now. If he can win the 2026 election and keep control of the House, he will be, I think, right after Washington and Lincoln as one of the great change agents in American history.
Doesn't that require a different kind of personality, not just mindset? In other words, Donald Trump's popularity with Mr. and Mrs. America is very significant. People have an attachment to him. There's not a lot of people in between that either love him or hate him, but it would appear that most people, or certainly a majority, love him and really appreciate him. And he seems to have a relationship with them. And that's why I've called him the blue-collar billionaire. He talks about tips. He's thinking of tips. Remember that famous scene when he was in McDonald's and so forth and so on. He thinks outside the box because, as you point out, there is no box. And as a builder, as a developer, these were the people he dealt with. He wasn't dealing with all these billionaires and so forth unless he had to. He was dealing with the guys who were working, the steel and the cement and on and on and on, checking out his properties and so forth. Isn't he different in personality and emotion because of that?
You have to go back and think about starting to run in 2015, coming down the escalator, being generally derided by the political class in the news media, putting together a campaign and picking a series of issues which outrage the establishment of both parties, and then basically repudiating George W. Bush's wars overseas, picking a fight, in a sense, with the Republican establishment, and running a brass knuckles campaign against Hillary Clinton, who everybody thought would be the next president, and then winning. Now, what's amazing is we now know from the things people have been reporting that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Director of National Intelligence, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, engaged in a methodical government conspiracy to undermine and weaken the duly elected President of the United States after the 2016 election. I mean, it is extraordinary the degree to which the entire establishment understood that this was life and death. And I think part of what happened, Mark, is Keegan wrote a great book called The Mask of Command. And in his opening chapter on Alexander, he makes the point that Alexander the Great would throw himself into battle because in the view of his followers, he personified their survival. So they couldn't afford to have him get killed. And so they would go into a frenzy to go save him. Well, Trump is the leader of a tribe. The tribe is the people who are sick of the establishment, sick of the left, sick of the corrupt cities, sick of the crime. And that tribe has a leader, Donald J. Trump. And every time the left attacks him, they all rally to Trump because Trump has become, he personifies now their hope for America's future. And that's why the iconic picture of him standing there with blood coming down and his fist up in the air saying, "Fight, fight, fight," is so galvanizing because this is the tribal leader speaking to his tribe, which is approximately somewhere between 50 and 55% of the country now. Well, not since Franklin Roosevelt have we had anybody with this level of emotional bonding. And I think it's why he has a real opportunity to be an astonishingly successful president.
Now, when you were in the House of Representatives, I remember watching. I remember my brother brought me your first book before you were elected. I still have it on my shelf. And I wondered, who is this guy? I was a young conservative activist, Tea Party movement. I was very active, involved with my book, Liberty and Tyranny, and so forth. I think that you had a lot to do with popularizing the conservative movement in a way that hadn't been popularized before, except with Reagan. So you kind of picked up where Reagan left off, and George W. Bush and Clinton came in between. When you were Speaker of the House, they always give Clinton credit for the balanced budget. You forced him to balance the budget. You forced the Democrats to the table. You shut down the government, and you did balance the budget. What was that like? I mean, what is it like herding all these squirrels, and you have a lot of people who are angry with you because you took out the establishment leadership, Bob Michael and so forth. So that's why I say you have a little bit of Trump in you, or he has a little bit of Newt in him. What was all that like?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was exhausting. We figured out one time, I spent about 106 hours a week working, probably 20 hours more than I should have. But we were trying to do a lot. When you have a party which has been out of power for 40 years, literally had nobody who had served in the House in a Republican majority except Bill Emerson of Missouri, who had been a page in 1954. I mean, that's the closest we were to having any knowledge of what being a majority meant. So you had to follow Reagan, and really the three key people who I followed were Lincoln, Reagan, and Thatcher. Lincoln had said at one point that with popular sentiment, nothing can fail. Without popular sentiment, nothing can succeed. There's a remarkable book about Reagan called The Education of Ronald Reagan, and it's about his 8 years at General Electric and what he learned about moving opinion in terms of dealing with blue-collar workers, where he gave over 480 speeches. And then Thatcher had once said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. And I was a fan of Thatcher's. I knew her. And, of course, I'd worked with Reagan starting in 74, and I began studying him in 65. So we very methodically, this is one of the things that frustrates me the most, Mark, we very methodically applied a series of steps that worked. And I've recently written a workbook on how to balance the budget. And I literally had to go back and take everything we did, lay it out, and show how it connected and worked. And my hope is that we can educate a new generation of Republicans and a new generation of conservatives. But Reagan, Thatcher, and I all had the same experience. While we were there, while we dominated, amazing things happened. The minute each of us left, Reagan leaves, Bush doesn't have a clue. Thatcher leaves, her successor doesn't have a clue. I leave, neither Hastert nor George W. Bush has a clue. Which is, you have a party which has to actually learn how to be an effective majority. Now, the difference now is, of course, you have with Trump this astonishingly charismatic figure. Calista and I have known Trump for a long time. And we're actually members out at Trump National. We used to see him long before he was a candidate. We first talked to him about running at a breakfast in Des Moines in January of 2015. I think he's a phenomenon. I mean, I don't think you can, just as Lincoln was a phenomenon, you couldn't imagine with Lincoln's background how astonishingly good he would be. And I think that's something people need to remember, that sometimes in history there's this magic moment when somebody appears on the scene and everything changes. My father's name was Robert Bruce Gingrich, and so Robert the Bruce had always been fascinating to me. And I'm adopted. I was originally a McPherson and again an O'Doherty, so I have Scots and Irish background. But if you go look at Robert the Bruce, who spends 17 years fighting to free Scotland from England, 17 years. Or you look at Washington, who spent 8 years. I mean, these people are phenomena, and without them, history's totally different. Well, Donald J. Trump is a phenomenon. And I think unless you start with that understanding, and his relationship, as you mentioned earlier, his relationship to his followers is a tribal relationship. He is of the blood of the tribe. He is the person they look up to, the person they revere, the person they want to follow, and the person who they will fight to defend. And that's why every effort of the left to put him in jail, the assassination attempts, the impeachment attempts, every one of those just strengthened the bond between the rest of the Trump tribe, or you'd say the Make America Great tribe, and Donald Trump.
You know, Newt Gingrich, I tell people, live in the moment, because you're living history. This is a big piece of what will be American history.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.